The writer, Maxwell Conroe, creates fiction with a twist. This latest episode of his Harlequin stories is titled Greek Tragedy. We learn more about the ancestry of Athena and how the writer himself, as he develops the story, increasingly suffers from hallucinations and illusions. Lately, he even hears the voice of a phantom, whom he converses with about what he thinks and writes. Okay, I'll be honest with you. As a writer, I cannot always tell whether what I think happened for real actually was real, or only imagined inside my head, and my head only. This is also the case for my encounters with Athena, a Harlequin who keeps reappearing in my life in very enigmatic ways. Oh, yeah, tell me more. Seated in my library alone at night, Athena will appear out of seemingly nowhere. She always giggles and she says that her goal in life is to entertain and invoke illusions. But during her last visit, she broke down in tears. Something about her mother being murdered by Athena, the Greek goddess. Who was the murdered woman? I remember Athena said her mother's name was Clytemnestra. Hey, Maxwell, do you remember that medical appointment? Oh, do I have an appointment? With whom? With whom do I have the appointment? I don't want to see my psychiatrist, not today. I have no appointment. This appointment was already canceled. And now I'm going to continue writing my story about this Greek tragedy. You see, these tragic events that occurred long ago have a lot to do with Athelene's sobbing. I shall immediately, without further digression, resume writing my new storylines for my narrator. Yes, Maxwell, that will be very useful and quite okay for me. I will gladly read these lines for you. Where was I? Oh, yes. Athelene's mother's name was Clytemnestra, and she was murdered by Athena. At least, that's what Athena claimed during her last visit when she started sobbing inconsolably. But before I could ask her any further questions, Athena had vanished into thin air, as is so typical for her. Sounds like she's seeking a strong shoulder to lean on. Maybe, but my real interest in this story was piqued so much that I started to read just about everything I could find about Clytemnestra. A woman by that name, indeed, figures in several Greek tragedies. And as Athena had already told me, this person did not die of natural causes. She was brutally murdered, as so often happens in these terribly bloody Greek tear-jerking tragedies. Oh dear, what are we getting into? This particular tragedy, featuring Clytemnestra, was written by the Greek playwright Aeschylus long ago, about 558 before the birth of Christ. The stories are all related to the great Trojan War that occurred about 3,000 years ago. Homer was the first to put Trojan myths in writing, but that was at least several hundred years after the fact. And then the later tragedy playwrights of 2,500 years ago simply recycled the myths. Of course, they embellished the cruelties, adding their own twists and flavors. Around the time Aeschylus wrote his theater play, the myths about the house of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra had already been told and retold for hundreds of years. Okay, hey, what happened in the play? Sadly, in all versions of the myth regarding the family tragedy of the house of Agamemnon, Clytemnestra was killed by her own son, Orestes. The reason for Orestes killing his mother is often portrayed as an act of vengeance for the murder that his mother had committed by killing his father, King Agamemnon. Apparently, Orestes had become Athena's designated assassin, encouraged to act as the killer for the three Furies, who were, in fact, sent after Orestes by no one but Athena herself. So you're saying Athena was an evil force? Well, at least three Furies, also known as Erinyes, were Athena's instruments of justice. And these three sisters were very serious about their business. Each of them had honed their own specialty to pursuit and bring to justice their designated targets. Tisiphone would measure out revenge and punishments. Alecto would be relentless in her pursuit for vengeance. And Megara would measure out intrigue to unleash envy and jealousy. Just like in the Three Witches of Eastwick, say. In this case, the three Furies collaborated in unison. Jointly, the sisters would seek retribution against those who committed capital crimes. The aim of the Furies was to restore order in society. But at the same time, the Furies were used by Athena for avenging the restless spirits of the dead by prosecuting criminal killers. Acting as Athena's divine agents of justice and retribution, the Furies would torment their culprits until they were driven to such madness that they would readily confess their crimes. I am beginning to like your story more and more. Thank you. But you see, in the classic murder story featuring Clytemnestra, it is easy to become quickly confused about who was murdered by whom, and even on whose authority were these murders instigated. I mentioned the old Greek myth about Clytemnestra's killing was transcribed by Aeschylus from a tradition of oral narration into his tragedy Orestes. Sadly, the serial killings all occurred within one family. In the end, Orestes is arrested for the killing of his mother Clytemnestra. Allegedly, he had killed her on behest of the three Furies, in order to avenge the death of his father Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae. I thought Edgar Allan Poe was the inventor of the crime novel, but now you have opened my eyes. Crime novels also came straight out of Greece. Indeed. You see, King Agamemnon of Mycenae was killed by no one less than his own spouse, Queen Clytemnestra. She is often portrayed as an evil witch, but the queen had every reason to hate her husband. He was an absentee who was away from his palace for over a decade to fight in the Trojan War. And Agamemnon had done two things that would have enraged any mother and spouse even today. His first infidelity was that on his way to the war in Troy, he had killed their daughter, Iphigenia. He sacrificed her to please Artemis, the goddess of fertility and hunt, who had promised Agamemnon, via her prophet Calchas, divine support for a victory, provided he would sacrifice Iphigenia, his youngest daughter, which he obliged to. What a jerk! Now I think of it, you are probably right. The second infidelity occurred at the end of a decade of warring, when King Agamemnon and his allies had finally won the Trojan War. Returning to his home in Mycenae, Agamemnon had no qualms introducing to his wife Clytemnestra his concubine named Cassandra, a princess he had kidnapped from Troy. Say what? Did the queen accept in bringing his concubine into the palace? Not really. The grief over the murder of her daughter was now amplified by the humiliating confrontation with Cassandra, which brought Clytemnestra, still the queen of Mycenae, beyond herself. She vowed to avenge her daughter's death and take measures to redeem her humiliation. The killing of her legal husband, the king of Mycenae, Agamemnon, she enacted together with her lover, Aegisthus, stabbing the king to death when he was enjoying a bath. Of course, Cassandra, who had now clearly lingered near the king for too long, was also slain along the way. Poor king! Poor Cassandra! But this was not the end of it. Next, Orestes killed his mother Clytemnestra, the queen of Mycenae, to avenge the death of his father Agamemnon, king of Mycenae. He got a little help from his sister Electra. According to Orestes, the oracle of Apollo had commanded him to tell her that she should help him kill their mother. It was Electra who lured her mother to her home with the news of a newborn baby, and with Orestes' help, kills Clytemnestra. Technically, that is called a matricide, a dreadful form of homicide involving one's own mother. You are right. But Orestes, after a brief trial in Athens, was swiftly forgiven for his matricide. Needless to say, the goddess Athena had a big hand in this whole sordid affair. And at the end of the story, even the Furies were pacified and transformed into the so-called kindly ones, the Eumenides. Never again would they act as the maddening Furies on behalf of Athena. All's well that ends well, said Shakespeare. Well, remember, Shakespeare lived 450 years ago, but the War of Troy occurred over 3,000 years ago. And at the end of the Orestes, the tragedy that Aeschylus wrote about the mythical story of the rise and demise of King Agamemnon and his family, Electra's fate is not explicitly stated. Hey, Maxwell, you mean we are left with a cliffhanger regarding the fate of Electra? Well, yes, exactly. And after all my reading, I begin to wonder, was Adeline's mother, Clytemnestra, really a ruthless murderer? And how could Adeline be alive today when Clytemnestra was already killed some 3,000 years ago when the Trojan War raged? And did Clytemnestra betray her royal duties and kill her husband out of hunger for power or out of vengeance for the death of her daughter Iphigenia, sacrificed by Agamemnon to appease the goddess Artemis? And was Clytemnestra right to be enraged about her husband's infidelity if she herself had a lover? I am not quite sure whether we should applaud or condemn Clytemnestra's actions. Hey, Maxwell, I think you're taking this all way too seriously. Of course, there exists no single-minded justification for any of these killings. It seems the various old Greek myths and tragedy stage plays featuring the death of Clytemnestra and her family members are full of moral ambiguity. They mercilessly exhibit the complexity of human nature, fragility of loyalties, and our propensity for loss of self-control, fueling total destruction in a profoundly irrational way when people have become gravely angered. Thinking over the various viewpoints, I am left with a sense of unfairness about how Orestes became orphaned by his own actions while becoming a murderer at the same time. The only person who could possibly shed light on this complex myth is Adeline herself. But will she bother to stop by once more and enlighten me?